The first time the insects landed, we thought it was a new kind of organic marketing campaign. It was June 14th, exactly 3 years after the Xenothrax ships first hovered over Earth's major cities, dropping their shimmering, glittering pods. The sky crackled with strange lights as the ships slowly descended. The night was still, a strange calm before the storm. People waited for the alien invasion to begin, unsure whether it would be an extermination or an offer for a new kind of intergalactic partnership, but when the Xenothrax finally made contact, they didn't annihilate us. They didn't even seem particularly interested in conquering us, at least not in the way we'd imagined. They hovered above us in their ships, exuding a strange aura of indifference, before casually dropping their first communication device. It landed on the White House lawn in Washington, D.C., a perfect metal orb, as though it had been placed with care by an invisible hand. The world watched as President Hartfield stepped out, waving his arms in what was supposed to be a gesture of diplomacy. His hand was awkward, almost like he was trying to mime his way through an intergalactic treaty. But the Xenothrax didn't seem to notice the president's peace offerings. They simply opened their ships and released swarms of tiny insect-like drones. They hovered like dust motes in the air, systematically scanning everything, including the president. One even brushed against his cheek, and for a brief second, it looked like he had swatted at it. That, apparently, was a huge mistake. The Xenothrax didn't see it as a hostile gesture. Instead, they seemed confused, almost disappointed, like someone offering their best dish to a guest only to have them spit it out. Then, the creatures retreated, leaving behind a cloud of questions. People tried to communicate with them. We sent our best scientists, our diplomats, even a couple of Hollywood stars, because, hey, who better to represent humanity than those who had mastered the art of pretending? But the Xenothrax remained silent. They didn't care. Then came the mutation. No one quite remembers when it began. It was a gradual thing, like a bad sci-fi movie you knew would turn into a train wreck but couldn't stop watching. It started with a whisper in the scientific community. There was talk of gene splicing, an attempt to understand the Xenothrax and learn from their biology. Scientists didn't know what they were dealing with. They thought, surely, the insects had some advanced genetic advantage. Their ships had hovered in the sky for over 2 years without breaking down, after all. They had to have something up their tiny, insectoid sleeves. So, we tried to splice. We tried to merge their DNA with ours. The idea was simple: mutate humanity into something that could live with these invaders, something we could coexist with. Sure, we'd probably have a few extra legs and maybe a couple of mandibles, but, hey, progress, right? That was the theory. But like most things in history, the theory was flawed. It all began with Colonel Eric Ward. Ward was a man built for war, broad-shouldered, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He'd served in the military, fought in the last couple of global conflicts before the Xenothrax invasion. When the genetic scientists at the research center needed a volunteer, he was the first to raise his hand, though he had no idea what he was signing up for. He didn't expect to become the poster child for a new breed of human, one that might just save the world, or, in his case, ruin it. They injected him with the first round of Xenothrax DNA, a cocktail of insect genes designed to boost his strength, speed, and resilience. The scientists promised him he would be faster, stronger, and better suited to survive in the new world order that the insects had begun to establish. The truth was far more complicated, and far more disgusting. Ward's body began to change slowly at first, like a weird science experiment you can't stop watching. His skin thickened, and he developed a strange sheen, like he'd been dipped in oil. His senses sharpened, and he could hear things, tiny, insignificant things, that no human should ever hear. His fingernails became claws, and his legs, well, his legs. That was the point where things started to get really weird. It wasn't just that he grew an extra pair of legs, the new appendages were something entirely different. They were insect-like, segmented, and covered in an iridescent exoskeleton. Ward looked in the mirror one day and saw a creature staring back at him that was only barely human. His eyes, oh, his eyes, were huge, bulging like those of a bug, and that's when the whispers started. "He's gone too far," some of the scientists said. "The human mind can't handle this." Others started to worry that he was more insect than man now, and it didn't stop there. The more Ward transformed, the more the scientists realized something even worse. Ward was gaining control over the insect swarms. It wasn't just the genes that had taken hold of him, it was something else, something darker. He started to hear the Xenothrax in his mind, understand their language, their instincts. The insects didn't just obey him, they worshipped him. That's when the trouble began. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Dr. Evelyn Morrow was trying to hold everything together. She was a geneticist, one of the top in her field, and had always been the first to raise her hand when new projects needed a volunteer. She'd been part of the team that had decided to pursue the Xenothrax project. She'd been optimistic once, sure that humanity's future lay in adapting to the new world. But as Ward's mutations progressed and the world spiraled into chaos, Evie started to realize the horrifying truth: humanity was no longer in charge. The Xenothrax had infected us from within, and the longer we resisted the natural order of things, the more disastrous the consequences became. One day, as Ward, now towering over 6.5 feet tall, stared down at Evie, she realized something even more disturbing. "We're not trying to survive anymore," he said, his voice raspy and insectoid. "We're just trying to exist." Evie stared at him, her mind racing. She had come to believe that she could fix this, that there was some cure, some solution. But it was too late. Ward was already becoming something else entirely. "Humanity was never meant to live with the Xenothrax," he continued, his eyes glowing. "We were meant to become them." The next few months felt like a blur. Ward began rallying his followers, humans who'd mutated into something monstrous, something between the two species. They formed their own factions, an army that was both human and insect, drawn towards overwhelming power. They no longer sought to coexist with the Xenothrax, they sought to dominate. And soon enough, humanity's worst fears came true. Ward's army, now known as the Xeno-Humans, launched a full-scale assault on the last remaining human strongholds. The hybrids moved faster, stronger, and smarter than anyone could have anticipated. They controlled the insect swarms, and they showed no mercy. Evie, now leading a resistance group of scientists and civilians, struggled to contain the outbreak. She knew that Ward had to be stopped, but how? He was more than just a man now. He was a weapon, a walking nightmare with the mind of a genius and the body of a Xenothrax. And she wasn't sure if she had the power to stop it. Evie's breath came in ragged gasps as she raced through the corridors of the underground lab. The lights flickered, casting long, angular shadows across the walls. It had been a few days since Ward's attack, and her team was running on fumes, frantic, desperate, and near the edge of collapse. It wasn't just the Xeno-Humans they were fighting anymore. It was everything. The planet itself was turning against them. The Earth, once a cradle of human civilization, had become a twisted parody of itself, its ecosystems warped by the presence of the Xenothrax and their influence. The air was thick with the sound of buzzing. The swarm. The Xeno-Humans were everywhere now, spreading like a disease. They had gone beyond being simple mutants. They were becoming a new species, a new form of life, and every passing hour made it more impossible to draw a line between what was human and what was insect. The hybrids had begun to command the very insects that had invaded Earth in the first place. Creatures that had once been viewed as alien and hostile were now their allies, their tools, their weapons. Evie had to stop Ward. She didn't know how, but she knew it had to be done. She couldn't allow him to spread his vision of the future any further. It was a future where humanity was not the dominant species, but a parasite, feeding off a new ecosystem, one in which the Xeno-Humans reigned supreme. There was one thing that could stop them. One thing she could still cling to: the weapon. Her mind raced as she thought of it, the ancient artifact, buried beneath the lab's foundations. The anti-evolution device. They had found it a week ago, hidden deep in the archives, its purpose unclear but its potential staggering. If they could activate it, the weapon would reset the evolutionary process. It would reverse the mutations. It could turn everything back. At least, that's what they thought, but then there was the catch. No one knew exactly what the weapon would do once activated. There were no guarantees. It could destroy the xeno-humans and the hybrids, yes, but it could just as easily wipe out humanity itself. Worse, it could reset evolution in such a way that no species would survive. The planet might be left in an even worse state than before. It was humanity's final gamble, and it was a deadly one. Evie felt the weight of that decision pressing down on her. She was the one who had helped create the problem. She had been part of the team that started the whole damn thing, convinced that Xenothrax DNA could unlock the secrets to human survival in the new world. Now, she might have to be the one to end it all, to erase everything they'd tried to do. But there was no other choice. If she didn't act, humanity would be lost. The xeno-humans would rule the earth, and everything humanity had built would be nothing but a footnote in the history of a planet that had outgrown them. A door at the far end of the hallway slammed open, and Evie's heart skipped a beat. She froze. A shape loomed in the doorway, a tall, dark figure that barely seemed human. Ward. His eyes glowed with that same strange light that had overtaken him, a cold, alien fire that now looked far more insect than man. His voice, when he spoke, wasn't quite human anymore. It was more like a buzzing hum, layered with an unnerving chorus of whispers. "You can't stop it, Evie," he said, his words vibrating with a low, unnatural pitch. "It's already begun. This world doesn't belong to you anymore. You were never meant to survive, never meant to adapt. You were meant to become us." Evie's hand tightened around the small device she had taken from the lab earlier. She could feel its power in her palm, the weight of it, a weapon, a potential world shaper. But it wouldn't be enough to stop Ward. Not alone. She needed to get to the central control room, where the master activation code for the anti-evolution device was stored. The only way to stop him was to overwrite the entire program, but Ward was blocking the only way out. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "This isn't about survival. This is about choice. You may think you've transcended humanity, but you're just another parasite. You can't control the future. No one can." Ward stepped forward, his elongated legs clicking on the cold concrete floor, a strange clicking sound like the tapping of distant insects. "I don't need to control it. I am the future." He raised his hand, and a swarm of tiny, glimmering drones buzzed to life around him, rising from his shoulders like an army of mechanical wasps. Evie didn't have time to argue. She knew that if she didn't act now, Ward would crush her and everyone else in the lab with his army of mutants. She lunged toward him, not with physical strength, but with the knowledge she had, how to use the anti-evolution device. She activated it, and in that moment, everything changed. A brilliant, white light flashed from the device. It was like a star going nova, expanding outward in a pulse that swept through the entire building. The walls shook, and the buzzing of Ward's drones fell silent as the energy rippled across the room, washing over them all. The change was instantaneous. Evie felt it first, a cold wave rushing over her as her body adjusted to the pulse. It was as though the very fabric of her being was being undone. The air seemed to thicken around her, the world tilting, bending. And then, for a moment, everything stopped. Ward screamed. But it wasn't a human scream. It was a howl of pure, raw panic. He clutched at his chest, his skin rippling, shifting. His form blurred, his massive legs twisting in impossible directions as the mutation began to reverse itself, at first slowly, then in violent spasms. His eyes went wide, and his body shrank down, collapsing in on itself as the xeno-human began to dissolve, revert, becoming something else entirely. Evie stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, her heart pounding. The swarm that had once obeyed Ward now hovered, disoriented, around the room, uncertain, confused. For a long moment, the world held its breath, then, just as quickly as it had started, the transformation ended. Ward was gone, the building was silent. Evie's hand was still clenched around the device. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, whether the weapon had worked as it was supposed to or had just wiped everything out, but now there was nothing. The mutated humans, the xeno-humans, the insects, everything was frozen in time, as though the world had pressed pause on the chaos. She staggered to the door of the central control room, pushing it open. She could hear voices, human voices, murmuring in the distance. Her team. The ones who had survived. Evie felt a strange sense of emptiness as she stepped into the room. She'd won. But the cost had been high, too high. The world was still here, yes. But it wasn't the same. Humanity had paid a price for its ambition, and it wasn't certain it could ever pay it back. She wasn't sure what came next, but at least, for now, they had a chance. A real chance.